Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 7th of February 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish, with me in the studio, of course, Mike Robinson. And we are delighted to be joined today by Vanessa Beeley and David Ellis. A lot of really important stuff going on in UK and overseas. Right?
Yes, indeed. And we're going to start off with the unsustainability of the press, because apparently it is utterly unsustainable. So unsustainable, in fact, that the government has decided to step in. So Theresa May has launched a review today, which she says is to preserve the future of high-quality national and local newspapers in the UK. She says the government says that the UK has always benefited from a strong, well-established and diverse press sector. However, over the past decade, the way in which people consume news has been transformed, and because it's been moved to the digital sphere, they're complaining that, apparently the current average annual revenue per digital media user is only £15 compared to £124 for a print media reader. So as a result of that, the media is really suffering. The government is stepping in. They say a key focus of the review will be the local and regional press who face an uncertain future. They're also concerned about the impact of Facebook and Google and the digital advertising supply chain. And they're also going to look apparently at clickbait and how low quality news and if there is more than can be done to tackle the issue of clickbait and low quality news and determine that undermines any commercial incentives associated with it. So what did Matthew Hancock, who of course is the Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, say? He said, robust, high-quality journalism is important for public scrutiny and underpins democratic debate. And he said, this review will look at the sustainability of the national, regional and local press and ensure that the UK has a vibrant, independent and plural-free press as one of the cornerstones of our public debate. Now, that of course, I would suspect he would argue he meant that it's a plural media, a plural-free press, but of course there's no comma in there. So it says plural-free press. It could equally be read that what he's aiming for is a single unified narrative right across the mainstream media.
Well, that is where they're heading for, in my opinion, Mike.
Well, that's very true, because here, thank you for Patrick Henningsen for pushing this through to me this morning. This is Presto. This is in Italy. And apparently this is our personal news assistant for the upcoming Italian elections. And they say if you're covering the elections, we can provide you with explanations, data and numbers, translations, quotes, sources to interview and more for free. We are Press Sources, a startup providing services for news professionals. We're ready to be your personal news assistant for all your Italian needs. And there's a journalist of 10 years experience behind a team of people behind this company. And it says, well, how does it work? Contact us through the form or shoot us an email. Tell us what you need. And basically they will provide everything that you need as a media outlet to cover the Italian elections. This is spectacular if this is the trend that we're going to see with this unsustainable media and smaller companies coming along and providing the mainstream media with all the facts you'll ever need to present.
You don't need to think.
You don't need to think. You don't need to investigate. You don't need to do anything, because it's going to be provided for you. In the UK, it's going to be provided for you by the government. No need to worry about that. And just to sort of finish this section off before I ask for comment, let's talk about Newsweek. Because yet another mainstream media outlet letting go of huge numbers of staff, senior staff, and why are they doing so? Well, basically Newsweek in trouble because one of their long-standing reporters, Matthew Cooper, announced his resignation. That's on top of David Sirota, who left yesterday, and also Celeste Katz and Ken Lee, who were executive editor and investigative reporter. They were sacked. So senior staff being removed from Newsweek. This is being portrayed as being something to do with the fact that some of these people were investigating the finances of Newsweek. So Newsweek employees investigating the financial situation of the company that owns Newsweek, and that was the reason for the purge. But in fact, Matthew Cooper said he was resigning not because of the investigation into the magazine's finances. He said, leaving aside the police raid, so there's a police raid associated with that as well, and the harassment scandal, it's the installation of editors, not Lee and Rowe, who recklessly sought clicks at the expense of accuracy, retweets over fairness, that leaves me most despondent. So that was the main reason he left. So again, we're seeing an example of people leaving a mainstream news outlet because of this charge for clickbaits to try to maintain revenues.
And we've seen this right the way across the press. Let's just remind ourselves here of this. We reported this a couple of months ago, the BBC setting itself up as Guardian, we said, of its own truth. And this was 8 million being made available to put 144, quote, full and part-time local democracy reporters. So the BBC putting out its tentacles into local level papers, of course, many of those owned by much bigger titles, some family press still about. But here was the BBC burying its journalists in amongst what we would assume to be local news. The government controls the lot. We're virtually Stalinist Russia, I think, Mike.
Well, it's certainly heading that way. Vanessa, we're going to come on to The Guardian in a second in particular and an update on what we were covering last Friday. But this has got to be cause for concern. If the government is so concerned that its outlet for its narrative is in commercial risk, that it's having to step in to carry out a review to try to keep the whole thing going.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary. I think sustainable media should translate to narrowing the bandwidth and excluding any half-decent journalists that are left inside state-sponsored or state-sanctioned corporate media in the West. What we're seeing is, of course, the media maintaining its role, and particularly The Guardian, as gatekeepers of truth and guardians of power. That is the only way that they can be described now.
Well, let's just remind ourselves of last Friday's programme, because we were talking about this organisation, Doc Society, which was founded by Channel 4 and partnering with BBC, Bertha Foundation, Ford Foundation, Sundance Foundation. And we pointed out that it then spawned this organisation, Good Pitch, which had funded the organisations which had created the White Helmets documentary, which Netflix had produced and had won an Oscar. And we said that, well, you trace this back, it all goes back to Channel 4, the BBC, and The Guardian. And we pointed out that the new White Helmets documentary, Last Men in Aleppo, also organised through Good Pitch, and that was being made by a guy called Faraz Fayad, and that, you know, the usual suspects are involved in this, right through to the Open Society Foundations and so on. Yesterday, I think it was, Vanessa, The Guardian has hit back, and it is your old friend Olivia Solon who ran the hit piece on you in The Guardian not so long ago, but she seems to be becoming even more hysterical this time because apparently Russia wants to hack the Oscars. And this is a smear campaign which is targeting the Syrian nominee because Last Men in Aleppo up for an Oscar. This is a spectacular response.
Well, it's a spectacular response in the sense that it's totally devoid of any divergent view or any context. I mean, they've not addressed any of the evidence, both against... Actually, there has been no accusations as such against Faraz Fayad. So this is, as usual, playing the victim card, both by the writer, Olivia Solon, who again has reverted to a protected Twitter account. And of course, The Guardian is not allowing comments on this article, as it didn't on its previous review of Last Men of Aleppo, and of course, of the Nobel Peace Prize lobbying for the White Helmets in 2016. In fact, any articles alluding to the White Helmets, basically you will probably find that comments are either censored, deleted, or not allowed at all. So basically, this is another straw man victimization of a key player in the propaganda for Al-Qaeda, aka the White Helmets in Syria. That's Firas Fiad. He's not been individually attacked. But what has been attacked is his work. What has been attacked is his portrayal of the suffering of Syrian civilians in East Aleppo, which was very real. But it was entirely due to the terrorist occupation of East Aleppo, to which Firas Fayed, in his sort of dramatization and romanticization of the role of the White Helmets, never alludes to. So he's basically eradicated terrorism in Syria through this so-called documentary. And The Guardian, as I've just said, is gatekeeping truth. I mean, beyond belief. It's not even just gatekeeping. I'd say it's just filtering and doing absolutely everything it can to run a protection racket on this organization. And at the same time, denying the facts, denying history, denying the evidence from the Syrian people, and denying a voice to the majority of the Syrian people. It's extraordinary. As someone, the Off Guardian actually opened a page for comments on this article, and it has been doing that regularly on Guardian articles. And it's worth going to the comments on that page, because they're very intelligent, very informed, and very interesting. But one person has actually said this morning, Fayed and Solon are basically saying, if Last Men in Aleppo doesn't get the Oscar, it's only because Putin is hacking the voting. This is the insanity to which, I mean, even as I say it, that's just one of the most insane statements I've ever had to, by default, utter. Yeah. It's extraordinary.
Okay, well, one of the other things that we mentioned yesterday was the issue of chemical weapons, and I'm just going to remind everybody of the video that we showed yesterday. Of the new UK representative to the United Nations Security Council and his comments on this recently.
The reality is that for the citizens of Idlib and eastern Ghouta, nowhere is safe. We're holding this session in the open chamber today after a series of reported chemical attacks in eastern Ghouta within the last month, as the Assad regime continues its merciless bombing and killing of civilians.
Right, well, that makes the point. Vanessa, merciless killing and bombing, chemical attacks, Idlib, East Ghouta, the narrative doesn't change. They don't seem to have a different script. They don't seem to be able to produce any alternative narrative.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Again, we're seeing this repeat spin cycle. I mean, it always starts, all of these interventionist wars begin with the demonization of the existing government or of a leader, then followed by crippling sanctions that only affect the people, and then, of course, followed by the weapons of mass destruction, which is, essentially that's what they're running again. They're running the weapons of mass destruction line again, and, of course, including images of the incubator babies, which are now flooding Twitter and social media, produced, of course, by the White Helmets. So let's go back to this statement. The evidence is coming exclusively this time from the White Helmets. No need to make any comment on that. So it's coming exclusively from Al-Qaeda. Now, from my personal experience, bearing in mind I only left Syria a couple of weeks ago, I went to within 100 meters of the areas of East Ghouta, Joba, Kabun, all the eastern suburbs of Damascus. Now, those areas are heavily residential, but they're also what would be called a hot zone. In other words, they're a military zone because of the campaign against the terrorists, mostly Jaish al-Islam and Nusra Front, who are embedded in those areas, holding civilians hostages. I mean, let's remember in East Ghouta, we've seen civilians put in cages as human shields. Why is the UN not mentioning this crime against the Syrian people committed by the terrorists that they're financing and arming? And there are also Syrian Arab Red Crescent units embedded in the area to basically offer humanitarian corridors for the civilians in those areas to escape and receive medical treatment, food that they've been deprived of by the terrorists that are taking in the humanitarian aid that is regularly delivered to those areas, and depriving the civilians of medical treatment, food, and of course mistreating them as they were in East Aleppo. I know from the reports from both the Russian humanitarian organizations and from Syrian Arab Red Crescent that those humanitarian deliveries have been going in, and that corridors have been open for civilians and hostages of the terrorists to be able to leave. And even amnesty has been given to armed militants in those groups to leave and to go to Idlib. So, this has been completely eradicated in Western media. But what is also being eradicated is the almost daily attacks on Syrian civilians in the areas of, for example, the Christian Bab Touma area of the old city. The day that I left Damascus, I think you remember that 9 people were killed, among those mostly children. 3-year-old Elias Kouri, a 16-year-old girl, has had her leg amputated below the knee because she was hit with shrapnel from the mortar attacks that day. 2 days ago, a mother and child was killed in another sort of rain of mortar attacks from eastern Ghouta. So while they're suffering from these alleged chemical weapon attacks, it doesn't stop them from mutilating and maiming Syrian civilians in Damascus itself. Secondly, why would the Syrian government be using chlorine gas, which is one of the most ineffectual weapons going? And why would it be using it in an area where basically it has its own army, it has Syrian Arab Red Crescent, it has its Russian allies, and it also has civilians who are on the front line. So they're not actually in the occupied area of East Ghouta, but they are literally 100 meters from the front line where the terrorist occupation begins. So why on earth would the Syrian government that is winning the war militarily use chemical weapons in an area where it would affect its own military forces and its own civilians at a time when it would be, diplomatic suicide for it to do so? And let's also remember the history of the chemical weapon propaganda is always going to coincide with Syrian Arab army advances and with Russian-led diplomatic resolution of this conflict. So coming only 2 days after the end of the Sochi talks.
Yeah. Now we have a short video clip here, Vanessa. Just tell us what this is about.
Well, basically, this was a message from a child 2 days ago to their mother. They were in school. They were forced to stay in school because of the mortar attack, so she couldn't come home. And this was an emotional message from a child to her mother saying, whatever happens, I love you.
And it's read out by?
It's read out by a friend of mine in Damascus who sent me the message and who also sent me the translation recording.
Okay.
The photo says, "Mother, I don't know today if I'm gonna go home alive or not. A martyr just landed in front of our school and they won't let us go, and the situation is really bad. If anything happened to me, just know that I love you." Her mother answered, "What are you talking? Don't talk like this, my darling. Inshallah, nothing is gonna happen."
So mortars landing near schools on a regular basis?
Yeah, I mean, normally the time that the terrorists will choose to target these civilian areas is, as I experienced, exactly when the children are leaving school. This is deliberate and systematic targeting of school children, of Syrian civilians. If this were a revolution, why are those mortars not targeting the Syrian Arab army or the Russian forces? No, instead they're targeting civilians, and that has been the case throughout the 7-year war that's being inflicted on the Syrian people.
Okay, Vanessa, thank you very much for joining us today. That's been fantastic. We'll move on. Brian?
Yes, we still got Mr. Ellis.
We do indeed, yes.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, we're going to, well, the subject really is truth, isn't it, Vanessa? You're pointing out that the truth is not being said about what's happening in Syria. We know the truth isn't coming out in British newspapers and the media. With respect to UK defence matters, which we're going to speak to David Ellis about, the truth hasn't been coming out either. Before we bring David in, let's just have a little bit of a recap of some of the material that UK Column has reported on. BBC here a while back was trying to say that there was a new threat from Russia because the Russians were targeting undersea cables. My response to that was, well, there's nothing new in this at all, because any nation looking at how it could attack another nation is going to look at communications. This was going on in the Cold War 20, 30 years ago, and there's nothing new here. So this is fake news by the BBC, even though they're reporting the words of Air Chief Marshal Sir Stuart Peach. This one, if we bring it up, this was your graphic from the other day, Mike. The Russians are apparently coming, but what's happening? We're cutting our armed forces, and this was a graphic showing that the Royal Navy has almost now been cut to a level where it is simply not effective. We've reported before on Britain's maritime patrol aircraft scrapped completely and utterly, complete with the scrapping of the training facility. So this was the whole capability scrapped, although the Russians are coming, you understand, we got rid of that. We've warned that Britain's entire fleet of attack submarines were effectively non-operational, or I'll qualify that, not fully operational. The mainstream press then amended their reports so that it didn't appear as bad as the ones they first put out. We've got this coming up, plans to merge the Royal Marines and paratroopers. And of course, this isn't a merger. This is a watering down of the capability of both these elite regiments, I'll call them. And this is a deliberate tactic. So this is being talked about today. But we were also reporting this a few months ago, and we were pointing out that whilst the Royal Marines were going to be cut with serious implications for Plymouth, what did we have Plymouth MPs talking about? The need to look after hedgehogs. So we were starting to question, I think we were beginning to question the mental capability of some of our MPs. Here with the Royal Marines, of course, being paraded because we were commissioning our new aircraft carrier, the aircraft carrier that we could produce a cake for, but we couldn't actually produce the aircraft to equip it with. Yeah. So what's going on here? This is almost Alice in Wonderland stuff, but we have to come back to this exposure from the UK column where we pointed out back in 2010 that behind the scenes, the charity, the Franco-British Council, had been setting up a new pact where Britain and the British and French defence capability was effectively going to be merged. The only media outlet that reported this has been the UK column. This is essential information. We also warned about the French taking control of British nuclear deterrent. We warned about this full EU control of the UK military. This is military unification is the correct expression, which I know David Ellis will like me to use that. This was part of your material a few days ago, Mike, where you were saying, well, it's launched. The EU military is now boasting it's up and running, shiny and new. Here's, yes, just a little bit of the video action on that one. We said here we've got the First Sea Lord, Philip Jones, telling us what's going on, because he says today the UK's national security is indivisible from that of continental Europe. The recent decision to leave the European Union does not change that. So it's Brexit without the exit. Nothing is going to change. And then we had Michael Fallon as former Minister for War, as we like to call him. Don't forget his expertise, nothing to do with the military. He was a children's nursery expert, and he got particularly virulent, if that's the right word, saying that all terrorists should just be killed. So we don't want trials on terrorists. And of course, together with his replacement, Gavin Williamson, same thing coming out about the terrorists, but of course it was Mr. Williamson who was telling us that the Russians were coming and we should effectively hide. Now where have we got to? Well, it's taken the local Plymouth Herald to put out a video saying that the whole of Devonport Naval Base is now under threat. The UK column was reporting this 10 years, sorry, I can't say 10 years ago, but 8 years ago. now it's taken a video, and they suggest that people should contact Theresa May. There's no mention of the local Tory MPs, Gary Streeter and Johnny Mercer. Gary Streeter refused to communicate with me when I asked him about those front page articles saying that we had no operational nuclear submarines. So David, we'll bring you in at this point because you have found some fascinating material, which is basically the Eurocore. There's no doubt that if we look through this European organisation, we can now see the heart of the beast. We are being fully integrated into a unified EU military structure.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Mike. Great to be back on the show, guys. Yeah, I mean, that's a really sort of succinct trip that you took everybody on there, Brian, as to just exactly what the charade and the propaganda is. That's actually the reality of what we're dealing with here is our military being, this nation's military being unified into a supranational military union, with single point control from Brussels. So all the democracy will be gone, obviously, because we all know that the EU is a tyranny. So, our own government is in effect arming a tyranny with our military. Now, despite this utter facade of Brexit, which seems to have accelerated all this, we've still had this problem all along with all of the political figures that purport to represent us refusing totally to engage on this issue and are still hanging on to this propaganda. And of course, the propaganda is immense. As you've just seen with the section there that you've done with Vanessa. So the same propaganda machine is at the end of it, is, hive mentality, running the same facade here with the military union. So we're not dealing with defence cuts. We've all got to realise that we're dealing with something called military unification, and all of this other stuff that's going on is all part of that, vital objective for the EU to attain their military, i.e. attain ours, for free. We give it all up for free, which we've all been paying for all this while, with all our mums, dads, grannies, granddads, great-granddads, and so on and so forth. We've all had an investment in this with blood, sweat and tears. So we're going to give all that up for free, and then we're going to get a tax bill. So this is Brexit. So my stance at the moment is that we're seeing some of the Brexiteers say, the Brexiteers on the front bench of the Tory party and the backbenchers, we want no to customs union. Okay, but it's actually yes to military union. So there's the hypocrisy. Because they've had a bit of a stall with the PESCO. There's too much media, independent digital media and footprint being registered across the sort of Twitter and Facebook and so on about PESCO. So that's slightly stopped, but they've gone to plan B, which is they're going to do it through one step at a time, but like eating an elephant, I suppose. It's a big thing to achieve absolute military union. It's a huge task, and it's lots and lots of little steps.
David,
like EU,
like
EU NAVFOR.
Sorry, David, if I just come in there, let's show our viewers and explain to listeners what we can now see within the European Union. So we'll bring in this first one, which you pointed out to us. So we've got Eurocore, a force for the European Union and NATO. This is a very significant comment, and NATO. So it says, as a multinational, fully deployable and highly autonomous headquarters, Eurocore is prepared to plan and conduct military operations across the full operational and intensity spectrum by commanding assigned forces as decided by the framework of nations to the benefit of international organisations, especially the European Union and NATO. So people can go to this website and look at this material for themselves. There's a lot of detail. Eurocore is strengthening its relationship with other European security partners as the European Gendarmerie Force, or the French-German Brigade. Now, the gendarmerie is an important point to bring in, because if we're talking EU military unification, we're automatically bringing in the police. People simply don't realise that we've got the privilege still here in the UK of effectively being policed by consent by a civilian police force. This is not the case in Europe. Let's have a look at this one. We got the mixing of nationalities is visible in each cell, and that's exactly what it says in this part of their material. It says that basically it's not going to be just national forces working together. They are going to be broken down and mixed at the lowest level. So they say the mixing of nationalities is visible in each cell, section, platoon, company, branch or division. All men and women of Eurocorps wear the same beret. So nationality goes out the window. These are drawn into this organisation. I couldn't help having a slight chuckle there because they made a small typo on their page. So I think that should be a unique status in the heart of Europe has become statutes. But there we are. I hope their operations are better organised than their English. And then we can also see that this is working with NATO, fully with NATO. So it says here, immediately after the creation of Eurocorps in 1992, it was decided to put our Army Corps at the disposal of NATO in order to show the Allies that Eurocorps was not only a new European unit, but also complementary to the defence efforts of NATO. So no mistaking this, David. We've got the European unified military structure now working in alongside NATO. There's another organisation here, which is the NATO Response Force. So they now set up something which is coming back the other way. The next NATO Response Force standby period for the Eurocorps will be in 2020. Eurocorps will again assume the role of a NATO land component command. So 1 minute you're thinking, yes, NATO is still there and doing its job. The next minute you realise that actually it's already integrated into the European project and they're going to drift back into that NATO structure.
Absolutely. It's hiding in plain view. This is unified militaries, whether that be either through the NATO umbrella and brand or whether through the EU, but ultimately it's unified military into military union under single control of the EU. It's perfectly, this is out in the open now. So, people, as I've sort of strategically forecast for quite some time that this would happen to NATO. And it's a fait accompli. NATO doesn't have a bank. The EU does, and it's a given. The decisions are being made from that perspective.
Right.
So the key thing there, of course, is that they're now talking about they're going to have a common uniform. So this is going to be I should imagine this will accelerate quite quickly. So, you'll see, as I've said before, there'll be conglomerates of troops and sailors and airmen and whatnot all sort of blob together from all over the place into units but they'll have absolutely, this is going to be the most abhorrent thing for the continent of Europe to sort of go through. Because who in commanding these as a captain or a sergeant or an equivalent warrant officer or whatever, when they get their orders from Brussels, who is going to say, no, we're not going there and we're not doing that? Because the orders are going to come from Brussels.
Well, David,
they're not going to come from Parliament. They're not going to come from our Prime Minister. The orders are going to come from Brussels.
David, you sent me through a copy of this tweet. Well, there's two of them here, and we'll bring them in at this point because this rams it home. We've got Major General Charlie Strickland here saying it was great to host the Right Honourable Mark Lancaster MP, UK Minister for the Armed Forces today, and bring him up to date on our holistic approach to counter-piracy and explore at EU NAVFOR's key role in the broader security architecture of the region. So here we're in Brexit apparently, but here we see senior British military personnel boasting that they're working hand in glove with the EU. And then this one here you also sent, which is this is basically the Crisis Management and Disaster Response Centre of Excellence. So this is part of the EU structure itself, the European Union Military Committee. I think this is part of. Correct me if I'm wrong, and I'll just bring them in here. As you drill into this, you see that the whole structure is set up. The United Kingdom is fully engaged in this EU military unification process, whilst Theresa May and the Conservative government simply lies to the British nation saying we are coming out of Europe. This is plainly not true.
Absolutely. How on earth can you be coming out of Europe when you're actually putting your cornerstone of your nation, your total and utter state leg of your nationhood, your military, into, subcontracting it in effect, if you want to use that word, to a supranational state? You're no longer a nation. You're not anything. You're part of this, and that's Brexit. But they're openly doing this now. So we've got a minister there, Mark Lancaster, and I seem to remember not long ago he was questioned in Parliament about this, and he was in utter denial about this was taking place. And yet we see him pop up at Northwood there. So it's our own Royal Navy nuclear headquarters there, where EU NAV4 has its crisis centre. Which isn't a crisis centre, obviously. It's a fully operational military C3H headquarters. So it's been there for quite some time. It's got over 100 EU staff in it, I'm reliably informed. And it's not noticed because it's designated a crisis centre when it actually is a military headquarters. So when Cameron was saying and May, I think, is still talking about this now, that they're going to veto the military headquarters for the EU. Well, that's awfully interesting because they've got one at our own Royal Navy HQ. So what on earth are you talking about? But old Mark Lancaster now there is in plain view. He's got a Twitter feed, as has EU NAV4, as has Commandant General Charlie Strickland. So can I suggest to everyone to send them some tweets and interject with them, because it seems to be the only way that you can engage with these politicians now is on that is through Twitter.
David, I think that's some very good advice. We say as always, make sure what you tweet is factually correct and is done in a reasonable way, because that has far more power. But you've got more on this story, Mike.
Yes, because I kept this for David the next time David was on, which is today, obviously, but this was released on the 30th of January, I think. This is the briefing paper from the House of Commons, European Defence, where's it heading? And they're discussing making progress on the Common Security Defence Policy. They say, first and foremost, in June 2016, the EU High Representative published a new EU global strategy for foreign security policy, which offered an overarching strategic vision for the EU's global role in the future and measures for achieving its aims. Security and defence was identified as one of 5 priorities moving forward. A security and defence implementation plan was subsequently adopted in December 2016, and specific measures included establishing a coordinated annual review on defence, that's CARD, to promote transparency and cooperation amongst member states, developing the EU battle groups so they're more usable and effective, enhancing and coordinating oversight of all EU missions, including establishment of a new permanent operational planning and conduct capability within the EU military staff, investigating areas for CSDP to cooperation using PESCO, enhancing partnerships with the UN, NATO, African Union and OSCE. And it says that in spring 2017, the Council of Ministers endorsed proposals on the scope, modalities and content of the Coordinated Annual Review on Defence, CARD, and a trial run involving all EU member states, including the UK, began in autumn 2017. They go on to say that full implementation is expected in autumn 2019, although participation of the UK is yet to be determined. And they say that in December 2017, the Council of Ministers also formally adopted a decision establishing permanent structured cooperation. 25 member states have joined 17 capability projects. Now, of course, the UK is not included in that, but the UK has just had its Franco-British summit where we've been effectively tied into that through the agreements made there. And it discusses EU-NATO cooperation, because this is not about the EU eventually removing itself from NATO or splitting away from NATO. This is about a merger, effectively, of the EU and NATO. They signed their joint declaration in July 2016, and a common set of proposals was endorsed in December 2016, according to this document. And then they talk about the Defence Action Plan, and so it goes on. They finish up by saying there is at present a political appetite for progress in European defence. If that is to be capitalised on post-Brexit, proposals for an independent permanent operational planning HQ seem inevitable, while proposals have already been put forward by the EU High Representative to create a longer-term finance mechanism for common security and defence policy operations. The extension of PESCO into full spectrum capabilities, should it prove successful, is also likely to be on the cards. And yet windows of opportunity such as this often prove to be short-lived. National interests must remain in sync amid broader global challenges, and the EU at 27 must all have a unified view of what they want CSDP to be and to achieve. Without the UK, Brexit undoubtedly offers opportunities, but equally national interests will dictate progress, and further integration in EU defence matters is not without other sceptical EU member states. It has taken decades of negotiation to get CSDP this far. Achieving a common European defence union is arguably likely to take decades more, with or without the involvement of the UK. But what's absolutely clear from this document, David, is that they are not saying by any means that that the UK will not get involved. They're merely saying, well, at least the agreements for what happens post-Brexit aren't public, so we don't know what those are going to be. But they're absolutely leaving the door open as a House of Commons for that to be.
Yes, they're avoiding the issue, and that's probably for one or two timing reasons in the political calendar, and the baseline fact that the British people will not support at the ballot box if they were aware of what EU military union was. And you've just laid the thing completely wide open and bare there, Mike, with your coverage of that paper. So there's no ambiguity with this, and this contradiction that we've had from Oliver Letwin and the policy chiefs at the Tory party of there being no votes in defence. What we're now looking at is there's no votes in EU defence. So what we're going to do is just not talk about it. And this is consistent with what we've seen over the last 5 years. So they're going to have to talk about it at some stage, and that's going to be the problem in effect, because if the general public in this country knew what was going on here, they would not support it, and there would be a public whiplash. So that nobody be under any sort of misapprehension there. What we're talking about is this EU defence policy, EU global policy, EU procurement, EU budget. EU will have absolute, total and utter tyrannical single point control over all defence and defence services in the EU zone. And as it stands at the moment, with this sort of okey-cokey that we've got at the moment, where there's been no definitive answers other than ministers are continuing with what I'm submitting is the unification process of cuts with our armed forces, and there's no sign of that abating. So it would suggest at the moment that as it stands at the moment, they're going to wait, and when it's a little bit quiet, a little bit convenient, we'll just find ourselves sweetly in. So that's no good at all. It needs stopping. It needs public to get out there and get active and get dealing with this. Otherwise, there is absolutely no Brexit at all with this. It renders the whole thing a utter travesty.
Okay, David, thank you very much for that.
Well, to follow on from that, then, I mean, we've been talking about the federalisation of the European Union for quite some time now. Yeah. Before Christmas, we had evidence of them moving quickly towards banking union on top of fiscal union. And we mentioned on Monday the possibility of a European debt agency. So we've got centralised debt management as well. The EU has pushed out this yesterday. This is the European Commission's expansion plans for the EU. And it's a Q&A in the form of a Q&A. And they say a credible enlargement perspective for and enhanced EU engagement with the Western Balkans. So they want to move into the Western Balkans. They're saying that a merit-based prospect of EU membership for the Western Balkans is the Union's own political, security and economic interest. It is a geostrategic investment in a stable, strong and united Europe based on common values. A Western Balkans summit is taking place in Sofia on the 17th of May, where EU leaders will continue discussions and engagement with their Western Balkans counterparts. The EU's enlargement policy must be part and parcel of a larger strategy to strengthen the Union by 2025. The strategy is part of the broader roadmap for a more united, stronger, and more democratic Union, in line with which the Commission puts forward initiatives aimed at improving the democratic, institutional, and policy framework for the Union of 2025. Our Union must be stronger, more solid, and more efficient before it can be bigger. So what are we looking at here? They're saying that they're asking, does the EU commit to 2025 as an accession date for new countries? And they're saying that 2025 is neither a fixed nor a target date for accession, but it's clearly a target date for the countries that may want to join. And we're talking about Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Serbia. And Ms. Mogherini had this to say. She said, it's clear. It is clear today, and this is the message, we will share a common future inside our European Union. Let's bring the Western Balkans inside the European Union, not in a faraway future, but in our generation. Yeah. So expansion, federation, it just continues to grow at an unbelievable pace.
It's a dictatorship growing in front of our eyes, Mike. And as David Ellis has just said, what's happening very serious. Because if this thing continues to take over UK, we simply do not exist as a nation state anymore. We'll end on a happier note, and we'll bring in subject of John Wedger, this very brave former Met detective constable who spoke out about child abuse. John is doing a walk from London to Manchester. He needs £5,000 to complete that walk. We put out an appeal yesterday. He was on £1,450 yesterday. It should say, I beg your pardon, on the bottom it should be February, of course, and not January. But we're delighted to say today he's up to £1,900. So we say, very brave man to do what he did. He now needs our support in order to get more of the message out. Please help him by making a donation. And we know that, of course, as more information comes into the public domain, more people come forward with information, which is exactly what we need. So if you've already donated, thank you very much for doing that. If you haven't, please look out for that Just Giving page and give John some financial support. That's it for today's news. David, thank you very much for joining us. We will be back at the same time tomorrow. Look forward to seeing you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.